Jordie, my friend, there has been a lot going on in the world recently, and I'm a little bit out of the loop on this particular subject. So I was wondering, what has been going on in the world of trilateral militarization recently?
Well put, James, well put. So last time we spoke, I believe we were talking about the Pentagon's review into AUKUS. Pete Hegseth, the US official, pressuring Australia to spend more on defence, obviously wanting Australia to spend up to 5% of GDP at the Shangri-La military conference in Indonesia.
Yeah.
Well, since we spoke, there was the NATO annual conference held, where all of the countries inside NATO come together and discuss about how they can further militarise the North Atlantic.
Of course.
Yeah. So
a perfectly sane and and sustainable goal.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So Richard Marles, Australia's Defence Minister, went to the NATO summit. And I just want to talk a little bit about the NATO summit because, as you're aware, look, we're a little bit late to the party. There were some hilarious moments from the NATO summit.
There were.
Some really funny moments. I thought we should probably go over, have a look at that, and then we'll discuss Pentagon Penny's trip to the US to meet with her fellow Quad leaders to discuss AUKUS.
Before you get into that, Jordie, I just did have a quick query. Australia is not in the North Atlantic.
It's not. We're in the Indo-Pacific.
Indo-Pacific. So why was Richard Marles, our defence minister, going to the NATO summit?
Well, we will get into that shortly, but I think you'll find that NATO is not exclusively a geographic alliance. No. We are now entering the era of global NATO.
That sounds terrifying.
Yeah. So we should begin with NATO.
Yeah.
So not surprisingly, Trump was the centre of attention at the conference. There was photos have surfaced of all the world leaders kind of trying to cozy up to him, waiting in line to talk to him. And previously, he's been quite dismissive of NATO. He's threatened to leave the alliance, has basically said that all the European nations are just freeloading off the US, that it doesn't benefit the US, that it costs the US, etc., etc. As you and I would argue, however, is that NATO benefits the US. It's kind of used as its militaristic imperial tool to basically topple governments that it doesn't see fit, and it uses the European countries to form kind of like a global empire, per se.
Yeah, and that's obviously in kind of the European region.
Yes.
Obviously, that's their tool of force projection in the European region.
That's right. And NATO, in a lot of ways, has benefited the Europeans because they haven't been able to, they haven't needed to spend a great deal on their military. And instead, they've been able to focus more on social spending, education, things like that. And that's why you see in Western Europe and even countries like Scandinavia a better standard of living, should we argue, compared to the United States.
Of course.
Definitely. So in part, Trump has been quite dismissive of NATO. However, things have started to shift recently, just especially from this summit. Because what he's been able to do, he's been able to convince his European counterparts to boost spending to 5% of GDP over the next decade.
Do you think that his quote-unquote opposition to NATO was like a lot of the thing, like a lot of his rhetoric in the lead up to his election, where he was espousing all these kind of more populist kind of policies and populist thought that he was running on? And do you think, and he was saying an aspect of that was, well, why are we quote unquote subsidizing NATO, America first, et cetera, and we're now seeing him go back on a lot of that, not just in regards to NATO, but pretty much in regards to all
the multilateral organisations.
Yeah, of course. So do you think that was all just empty rhetoric for political purposes?
Most definitely. It is quite difficult to make head and tail of what Trump actually means when he talks. What's the saying? It's just like take him seriously, but not literally.
Yes, that seems accurate.
That does seem very accurate. So during Trump 1.0, the first administration, he even threatened to leave NATO. However, I think there's been a change of mind, mostly because I think the US realises that by increasing the spending of their European counterparts in NATO, it benefits the US military industrial sector greatly.
It does, because lots of the dollars flow back for the United States.
And now that a lot of the US's stockpiles have been spent by obviously giving arms to the Ukrainians and the Israelis, they are now looking at boosting production. And where should they sell those weapons to? Their European counterparts in NATO.
Of course.
Makes perfect sense.
And just to digress a little bit before you continue on with what you were saying, do you think, would you agree with me when I say that, for example, one of the reasons the Americans would like NATO to boost their spending and become a little bit more self-sufficient in the NATO bloc as a whole is so that America can essentially leave them to deal with the Russia-Ukraine situation whilst it pivots to the Middle East and to the Indo-Pacific region to deal with what the strategic planners of the empire would kind of deem as bigger threats.
Definitely, I agree. However, I'd also point out that I think the Europeans also want this as well. So we've seen Keir Starmer, even Macron have been huge advocates of continuing the proxy war, saying that even if the US basically abandons Ukraine, they will continue to support them for as long as it takes, that we hear over and over.
Yep.
So I think the Europeans they independently want to continue that policy going forwards.
They really love war, don't they, the Europeans?
They do.
Whether it's amongst themselves or I guess if they're all united in one block, then they can fight someone else, can't they?
Yeah, that's right. If you go back and look at the history of Europe, it's just really one conflict after the other, isn't it?
Yeah, continuously.
One moment from the NATO summit did stand out, and look, people may have seen this. You and I have. It was quite a alarming and funny moment that I think is worth looking at.
Absolutely. I think it perfectly encapsulates the relationship at play here as well.
So this was the NATO General Secretary, Mark Rutte, who had these comments towards Donald Trump.
Iran war.
They fight like hell. You can't stop them. Let them fight for about 2-3 minutes, then it's easier to stop them.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language.
That's the NATO Secretary General and former Dutch Prime Minister, the Commander-in-Chief, revelling in it.
He called you Daddy earlier. Do you regard your NATO allies as kind of children?
No, he likes me. I think he likes me. If he doesn't, I'll let you know. I'll come back and I'll hit him hard, okay? No?
But he
did it very affectionate. Daddy, you're my daddy.
Ooh, that hurt. Yeah. That hurt my soul.
It's a very cringy moment.
That is incredibly cringe. And I think Mark Rutte would be very happy to be spanked by Donald Trump if he was to do something naughty.
I do like Trump's Trump's understanding of global politics, where it's just like, two kids in a schoolyard fighting at it. He's going to let them go for a few minutes, break them up
afterwards, let them get it out their systems.
Yeah.
It's a fresh take on global politics, shall we say? But that is truly cringeworthy, truly hilarious.
Yeah.
And I think, that perfectly demonstrates the subservience of these tiny little European nations.
No, definitely.
To the daddy.
Yeah, to the daddy.
To Donald Trump, who is the daddy in this scenario.
As per what they were discussing, though, just days before the NATO summit took place, we had the strikes against Iran by the US, and then before that, Israel. So we spoke about that briefly.
We did.
I was going through and I was actually reading the declaration from NATO, because they also have like a declaration after the summit, kind of just summarising their key points for the year and what their goals are and what they're aiming to achieve.
Yeah, that's nice, Their policy papers.
Yeah, their policy papers. What I found what stood out to me is that this year the whole declaration only consisted of 5 points, 5 paragraphs, very short paragraphs. With little to no mention of the Ukraine war. Obviously, this is kind of showing the Trump administration's shift away from the Ukraine war.
Yep.
So it simply states that NATO is, quote, united in the face of profound security threats and challenges, in particular the long-term threat posed by Russia to Euro-Atlantic security. Allies reaffirm their enduring sovereign commitment to provide support to the Ukraine, end quote. That was their only mention of Russia or Ukraine.
Wow.
There was no remarks towards China or even the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. Contrastingly, last year, the declaration was 38 paragraphs long.
Oh, goodness.
It was massive compared to this year's. With condemnations of Russia, China, Iran, NATO's ironclad support for Ukraine. One section even read, quote, "We are bound together by shared values, individual liberty, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. We adhere to international law and to propose the principles of the Charter of the United Nations and are committed to upholding the rules-based international order.
That's hilarious. And that sounds like quite a contradictory statement, if I do say so
It does.
myself.
And that was last year's statement. Mm-hmm. And the reason I think it was lacking this year was because, obviously, that the strikes by the US and Israel were in complete violation of international law and the UN Charter.
The UN Charter, yeah.
Just days beforehand, the US bombed Iran, targeting its nuclear facilities. And it seems that even NATO, an alliance which is ultimately a military tool of US imperialism, knows when to save face and is conscious of its blatant disregard for international laws and norms. I don't think they could actually come out and say those things they did last year.
No way. But do you know what? I would actually prefer I think there was kind of something very frustrating about the kind of Atlanticist liberal elite espousing all their so-called appreciation
norms
for
and
human rights
values
while they're so blatantly violating them. So I would actually prefer them just to come out and openly say, no, look, we like subjugating poorer peoples around the world. And that's
we're going
what
to support daddy and bombing Iran.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's more transparent to me. And honestly, that's more honest. I appreciate their honesty.
No, I do. Yeah. I do really appreciate the honesty. So as I discussed just before, Richard Marles obviously attended the NATO summit. Mm-hmm. Anthony Albanese, there was rumours that he was going to go and try and get the long-awaited meeting with Donald Trump, that he missed out at the G7 because Trump had to go back to the war room and discuss plans to bomb Iran.
Isn't Albo too busy meeting with Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party?
Yes, Albo next week will be going to China. That's next week's segment, James.
Okay, that's next week. Sorry. It's a little teaser for the audience there.
It is. So Richard Marles did attend the conference in which Australia sought to strengthen ties further with NATO.
Yep.
According to Marles, Australia will procure and supply more military equipment through its NATO allies. Marles reiterated Australia's continuing support for Ukraine, highlighting the old US-made Abrams tanks that we gifted them and the Australian drone manufacturers who are actively supporting the Ukrainians, which I actually didn't know that.
Neither did I.
That Australian drone manufacturers are providing supply chains to the Ukrainians for their drones.
I was aware that we had delivered, I believe we delivered Bushmaster armoured vehicles.
Yeah, and our old Abrams tanks.
Abrams tanks.
Correct.
But again, drones, there you go.
Yeah, and I think basically, as he highlighted, that there's going to be more of a consolidation between the supply chains of Australian weapons going into the NATO allies and Australia procuring more military equipment from NATO. And Marles also asserted that the threat to peace and stability in the Middle East was solely emanating from Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile program.
I knew it. Those Iranians.
Moreover, Marles repeated several times with journalists that the North Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific were two theatres with overlaying dynamics and similarities. I think, so here's a quote from Richard Marles. I think the way in which the Indo-Pacific on the one hand and the North Atlantic on the other are influencing each other in growing ways. What's happening here in Europe, what's happening specifically in the war in Ukraine is engaging Australia's national interests. And it's a really important gathering for us to attend.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
our national interests are based in a tiny little corner of Eastern Europe.
Yeah, in a US proxy war against Russia.
Maybe that's where my analysis lacks, Jordie. I didn't realise that.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I found that quite fascinating.
It's, again, interesting that he said that.
Yeah.
So he's, I guess, to an extent, saying the quiet part out loud, as in saying, this is what our role is in the in the political system. This is where we sit in the world order, and this is what it is necessary for us to do as Australians.
And it highlights that Australian policymakers are really trying to wed the kind of idea of the NATO alliance into the Indo-Pacific and also kind of create this greater NATO sphere.
Yeah. No, that's true. And I think, obviously, look, failing that, I guess this is a much more efficient option than, say, building a massive, a series of huge motors on the edge of our continental shelf and actually shifting the Australian continent
into the North
Atlantic. Into the North Atlantic.
Correct.
This is a much more efficient and cost-effective and feasible way to stay integrated, shall we say?
No, definitely, that's right.
Sorry.
So, James, just as the NATO summit was concluding and militaristic Miles was flying back to Australia,
Yep.
Pentagon Penny was flying towards the US.
Oh, goodness. So she has completed her transition from a human being into a five-sided shape.
Correct.
A pentagon.
A Pentagon. I think she launches from Australia and just flies straight to the Pentagon. They have a helipad for Pentagon Penny
Waiting for her
to just land down.
Yeah.
That's
I was
right.
going to say 5 even angles and 5 even sides.
Yes,
that's
just
correct.
like the Pentagon.
Oh, goodness.
So she flew to the US to
Yep.
meet with her counterparts in the Quad, which
goes directly against her being a pentagon. The
It
quad,
does.
referencing 4 sides and pentagon, Penny having 5. Sorry, please
it's
continue.
good. It's valid, James. It's very valid. So she met with her Quad counterparts from the US, India, and Japan to obviously just discuss containing China and reassuring Australia's commitment to that and to the Quad. So during the trip, they discussed AUKUS. Penny met with the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. And to no surprise, there was no concrete guarantees by the US that they would go ahead with AUKUS.
Yep.
Absolutely no surprise, not my surprise at least. Simply that the US understood the importance of the agreement for Australia.
Yes, all right. That is hilarious.
Yeah.
We've touched on this a lot, and we are really getting royally shafted with this whole AUKUS arrangement. Pardon me, as we discussed, on our last couple segments. So it's good to know that the Americans are happy to keep shafting us,
Correct.
and we are also happy to keep getting shafted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just happy that they're consciously aware that it's important to us.
Yeah.
Like, look, we acknowledge it. However, we're not giving you any concrete guarantees. So,
Keep sending us
Yeah.
hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, though.
Yeah. So what did come out of the Quad summit itself was that Australia is now posturing to supply the critical minerals to its allies. And obviously this is to act as a counterweight against China, which has a monopoly on the kind of the rare earth minerals and the critical mineral supply chain itself.
Yep.
I know that they do a lot of the processing of these minerals. It goes through Chinese supply chains. So the Quad's trying to act as a counterweight against that, and Australia will obviously supply a lot of those critical minerals to its allies.
And this is for things like, obviously, semiconductors, green technology, all these kind of emerging industries
Yes.
which are going to be critical for dominance and competitiveness in the world going further on into the 21st century.
So all of the advanced economies of the 21st century will need these critical minerals, and I've read now that Australia has something like 36 of the 50 minerals which are crucial in these industries. So as you said, they are very critical for advanced manufacturing, green technology, and the future of AI and quantum computing.
Yeah. And the Chinese have, I think, probably saw this coming maybe a decade or two ago, as they have,
Yes.
it's been a conscious decision of them to shore up their supply
Correct.
of these minerals.
Yeah.
And so they have kind of, I wouldn't say monopolized, but they have secured
A supply chain. They've secured their supply chains. Yeah.
in Africa, primarily in Africa and
Yes.
Central Asia. Whereas, for example, the United States and also parts of South America as well. Interestingly enough, I know
Yep.
in like Mexico, Chile, whereas the US is a bit late to the party.
Well,
in
James,
this regard.
Yeah, look, this is some of the pros of a planned economy. You're able to look ahead 10 years from now and say, okay, our industry are going to need these critical minerals. We'll ensure that we have access to it. Whereas if you just leave the market to its own forces, market forces,
The invisible hand.
they're not able to plan that in advance. So, yeah. While we're talking about critical minerals,
Yep.
we know that previously the idea had been floated for Australia to use its critical mineral supply as leverage against the Trump administration to drop its tariffs on Australian steel and aluminium. So I was reading an article by Richard McGregor in the Australian Foreign Affairs magazine, and he brought something to attention that I found quite astonishing, actually. So that earlier in February, Jim Chalmers, Australia's treasurer, met with the US Secretary of Finance and former Wall Street trader Howard Lutnick and expressed that the US fully expected Australia to support the US in an economic or hot war against China, meaning that Australia would have to cut ties with our largest trading partner, while at the same time the US was imposing tariffs against Australia in violation of our free trade agreement.
Nice.
The irony was not lost on me there
Of course.
whatsoever.
Yeah. And do you think where they're going to be paying us a fair market value for our resources.
I doubt that.
Yeah. All right. Yeah.
I also know that most of the mining companies that are extracting these critical minerals from Australia are partly or wholly owned by US foreign investors.
Of course, and they do not pay, obviously, their
No royalties and
their
taxes,
royalties and
etc.,
taxes.
etc. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to having my country literally strip mined, and then leave us with an ecologically damaged wasteland.
Yeah.
And with no potential for future earnings.
That's right, correct. And none of the wealth extracted reinvested into Australia.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Tell me more, man. Look, this seems to be a topic we've hit on quite a bit, actually.
It has,
It has seemed to be a reoccurring
because it
topic.
also just keeps reoccurring over and over and over because it's really, our critical minerals are the only leverage that Australia has to come to the table. So basically, whenever we're in talks with the US, we basically just keep bringing the critical mineral supply up. So hang on a sec, you can station your bombers here, your troops here,
and you can have
our critical minerals.
our critical minerals,
Yeah.
and we get absolutely nothing from it.
Yeah. No, what
Fantastic.
do you mean? We get US bases here in Australia.
Of
Come
course. Our security.
on. Our security.
Our security being like one of the most remote places on Earth
Yeah.
that no one really has any interest in,
Yeah.
in invading or attacking.
That's right.
But we need the security of
That's right.
US nuclear
It's our-
armed bombers and
That's it.
submarines.
US security for Australia
Yeah.
for security against the US when it decides to attack China.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dude, they're playing a good game. They
a
have
good game.
engineered a fantastic deal for themselves. I
Yeah.
will give them respect.
Look, while much of the Labor Party was in lockstep with the US
Yeah.
on foreign policy, there was one individual over the past few months that I have been looking at, and he's kept popping up. I've read a few articles by him, and I found it to be a breath of fresh air, should we say. And this gentleman is Ed Husic.
Yep.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with Ed.
I have heard the name.
Yeah.
Why don't you inform myself, your ignorant co-host, and our audience?
So Ed Husic is the Federal Minister for the seat of Chifley in Western Sydney. He is Australia's only and first Muslim representative.
Oh, wow.
He
Yep.
comes from a Bosnian family that immigrated in the 1960s. He was born here in Australia. And he's been really the only person outside of the Greens that kind of in the current government, in the Albanese administration, to voice any concern over the party's unanimous support for Israel or the US.
Yep.
So earlier in the year, Husic was dumped from his cabinet position for industry and science as part of a cabinet reshuffle. But he argues that this was because of his stance on Gaza. He's been critical of the government's tepid response to the genocide in Gaza. Writing for The Guardian, Ed Husic highlighted that the Labor Party has historically played a role in defying the feeble mind, highlighting Bob Hawke's consistent pressure against apartheid South Africa, Gareth Evans' contribution in bringing an end to the genocide in Cambodia, and Paul Keating's effort to build up the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, known as APEC, and the Australian-Indonesian Security Agreement.
Yeah.
So he's basically saying, look, the Labor Party has actually, at times in history, stood up for things that are very important, and I think now we should be doing a lot more for the people of Gaza.
Of course.
And then more recently, Husic once again broke from the Labor Party to criticise Israel and the US for their strikes against Iran. He told the ABC that, quote, "It's up to us and other countries like ours to argue for the international rules-based order. If it means standing up to the US and arguing our case, we should do so. My big concern in terms of what we've been seeing is a fraying of the rules-based order." Pretty sober words, in my opinion, nothing too radical.
Yep.
I find it very concerning that he is really the only minister of the current government to say things like this, and for that was pushed out.
Well, I was about to say, so it's obviously we can discern as to why he lost his position during this cabinet reshuffle.
And I know that Richard Marles orchestrated his ousting as well.
That's not comforting and not good to know, because it seems like the Labor Party are trying to essentially occupy an impossible position.
Yeah.
Where they obviously espouse lots of the things that Australians want to hear domestically. Yeah, in terms
like
of
not supporting a genocide.
Yeah,
support
or no,
for the UN Charter.
In terms of things like investing in housing,
Yeah.
green energy, childcare support, lots of the kind of things they won their most recent election on. But then they take a contradictory and a contradictory stance on the international stage
with their foreign policy.
With their foreign policy,
Yeah.
and essentially just bend over and
For the US empire.
for the US empire, correct?
Yeah. It's a breath of fresh air to see an Australian federal politician think so rationally, independently. However, voices such as Ed Husick are a minority, and as we've seen, if they rock the boat, they are simply tossed overboard.
Yes.
So I just wanted to finish up on this segment, and I just wanted to discuss a declassified Australia article that was just published after the strikes on Iran. It basically just talks about more of Australia's complicity in the ongoing genocide. So what Declassified have revealed that it's possible, even likely, that a lot of the intelligence that the US gathers here in Australia was provided through the extraordinary capabilities of the surveillance satellites used by the massive US bases located in Pine Gap on the outskirts of Alice Springs in Central Australia. There are other ways Australia is helping the overall US campaign in support of Israel. The Northwest Cape Surveillance Base near Exmouth in Western Australia provides communications and monitoring. Air bases in Northern Australia have been provided for US refueling tanker planes, supporting B-2 bombers heading to bomb Yemen, and to be stationed at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. And an Australian naval officer heads the US Multinational Naval Task Force, CTF 153, confronting the Yemen blockade of Israel-bound shipping in the Red Sea. I actually didn't know that. We have an Australian naval officer orchestrating the blockade against Yemen.
Well, he's not doing a very good job, is he? Pardon me.
No, it's a good point. But of course, the Pine Gap base provides by far the most important warfighting support, from collecting military communications to geolocating individuals for targeting, to detecting troop movements, to detecting and targeting missile and rocket launches. The Pine Gap base collects and provides this intelligence and analysis for the United States National Surveillance Agency, which then shares much of this intelligence with Israel, as Declassified reported in November 2023. So basically, Pine Gap is gathering a whole lot of information and surveillance technology and is for the NSA, and they're sharing this directly with the Israelis.
Of course, yeah. And we've talked about Pine Gap before, obviously that being a top secret US satellite intelligence gathering site in Central Australia where Australians aren't even allowed to go. It's essentially completely under the jurisdiction of the United States.
Yeah.
So we've kind of forfeited our sovereignty there.
Yes.
In regards to that.
Yeah.
But that does, again, demonstrate our complicity. We're not just an actor sitting there on the sidelines kind of, staying clear of it. We are complicit in what is happening.
Yeah, that's right. And contrary to what Albanese and a lot of the federal ministers in the Labor Party say, through the Pine Gap base, we are complicit, and through the manufacturing of spare parts and weapon components for the
Israelis.
For the Israelis, yes.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Well,
James, let's wrap it up there.
thank you very much. That was very enlightening.
Appreciate it.
We will continue to cover all these subjects in the future.
Yeah, please like, subscribe, and share. We'd really appreciate it. Until next time.
See you next time, guys. Ciao, ciao.